Hello students, today we will discuss here about the pollination, what are the types of pollination and what are the agents which are responsible for pollination. Now the students, this is another one very important topic in this chapter, that is the pollination. So all of you very well know that what is pollination. A simple definition arises here that the pollination, it is being defined as the process of transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma, that is known as pollination. So in case of the flowering plants, both type of gametes, either it may be male or it may be female gamete, they are non-motile in nature. So they are brought together for the fertilization by the process of pollination. This is the major contribution of pollination. As both the gametes, they are non-motile in nature, then how the fertilization will happen? So both of these male and female gametes, they are brought together so as to perform the fertilization only by means of pollination. When the pollination occurs, then only both the gametes, they come close to each other and undergo fertilization. So the flowering plants, they have evolved an amazing array of adaptation to achieve the pollination. A very special kind of adaptations which are found in the flowering plants for achieving the pollination that we will come across in the later slides. They make the use of external agents, that is the pollinators, so as to achieve the pollination. Now, what is the source of the pollen grain? And on the basis of that source of pollen grain, the pollination, they are having certain kinds. So the topic is kinds of pollination. First kind is autogamy, or you can say self-pollination. The easiest definition of self-pollination is that the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower of the same plant. That is known as the autogamy or self-pollination. If the pollen grains, they are transferred from anther to the stigma of the same flower, then that is known as self-pollination or autogamy. Suppose if there is a flower which is a normal flower and it opens, that flower is opening or blooming, then the anthers and the stigmas, they are very well exposed. Then in that condition, there will be the chances of cross-pollination. In the normal flower which opens, the anthers and stigmas, they are totally exposed. So there will be the chances of cross-pollination, means the complete autogamy is rather rare. Then in such types of flowers which are opened, then autogamy requires the synchronization in the pollen release as well as the stigma receptivity. Means the pollen release and the stigma receptivity, they are at the same time. Then only the chances of self-pollination will occur. And the other thing, that in such flowers, the anther and the stigma, they should lie very close to each other. Then only this favors the self-pollination. If there will be the continued self-pollination in the flowers, then this will results into inbreeding depression. What is inbreeding depression? That is the reduced biological fitness in a given population. Due to continuous self-pollination in a flower or in a plant, then this leads to the reduced biological fitness, because the new genes will not come into the plant and the variations will not arise. Variations will come only when the pollen grains, they will come from the other plant of the same species. Then there will be the chances of variations. So that will increase the biological fitness of that species. So if there will be the continued self-pollination, then this will results into inbreeding depression. Very important line, that what will happen if there will be the continued self-pollination? Then the answer will be, it leads to inbreeding depression. And what is inbreeding depression? That is the reduced biological fitness in a given population. This is diagrammatic presentation of this autogamy. That is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower. If this is the single flower on a plant, then the pollen grains from this anther, they transfer to the stigma of the same flower. This is known as the self-pollination. Another kind of pollination is known as geitonogamy. What do you mean by geitonogamy? Geitonogamy means when there will be the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of different flowers of the same plant, then that is known as geitonogamy. Means when the pollination takes place in between the two flowers of the same plant, then that is known as geitonogamy. If the two flowers, they are belonging to the same plant, means both the flowers are genetically similar, means such type of pollination, it is a self-pollination according to genetic point of view. Means genetically it is a self-pollination, but there will be the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of two different flowers, means it involves certain pollinator or a pollinating agent, means it is a cross pollination. But geitonogamy, it is, that's why we can say that it is a ecologically or functionally a cross pollination, but genetically it is a self pollination because both the flowers are of the same plant. So we can say that from the genetical point of view, geitonogamy is similar to self pollination because the pollen grains, they come from the same plant, and all the flowers of the same plant, they are genetically similar or identical. That's why we consider that geitonogamy, it is genetically a self pollination, but functionally, or you can say ecologically, it is a cross pollination. It is considered as a cross pollination because of the involvement of pollinating agents or pollinators. That's why we can consider ecologically or functionally as a cross pollination. This is the diagrammatic presentation of this geitonogamy, that this is the single plant bearing the two flowers, two different flowers on the same plant. If there will be the transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of one flower to another flower, then this is known as geitonogamy. Simply, both the flowers belongs to the same plant, having same genetic constitution, means genetically it is a self pollination. But since these pollen grains, they are moving towards or migrate towards the stigma of the different flower by means of certain pollinating agent, means it is a cross pollination, means ecological point of view or through functional point of view, it is considered as a cross pollination. Third kind of pollination is known as xenogamy or a cross pollination, or you can say allogamy. Means when there will be the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of different flowers of different plants, then that is known as xenogamy. Simply, the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of different plants, then that is known as xenogamy or allogamy or a cross pollination. When there will be the pollination which takes place in between the two different flowers of the two different plants of the same species, then that is known as xenogamy. And this is considered as the real or a true cross pollination. Genetically as well as ecologically, it is considered as a cross pollination. Genetically as well as ecologically, it is a cross pollination. This is the only type of pollination in which genetically different types of pollen reaches to the stigma, because the two different plants are involved of the same species, so genetically different types of pollen may reach to the stigma. This is the diagrammatic presentation of this cross pollination. These are the two different plants bearing the different flowers. If there will be the transfer of pollen grain from the flowers of one plant to the stigma of the another plant, then this is known as cross pollination, and it definitely involves the pollinating agents. Now, what are monoecious? What are monoecious plants? Monoecious means if both male and female flowers they are present on the same plant. Means both male and female flowers they are present on the same plant and both the flowers are unisexual, then such type of plants are known as monoecious plant. For example, in case of castor, cucurbits, coconut and maize, all these plants are monoecious in nature. If there will be the case of monoecious plants, then in such plants they prevents autogamy but not the geitonogamy. This is the monoecious condition. This diagram shows the monoecious condition in which both unisexual male and unisexual female flowers are present. Now, this is the male flower, then if these are the pollen grains, these pollen grains they may reach to the stigma of the another flower of the same plant. This is geitonogamy. So, it do not prevent the geitonogamy, but it prevents the autogamy. Here it returns that in case of monoecious plants, it prevents autogamy, but not the geitonogamy. Geitonogamy is present in such type of plants. Then what are dioecious plants? If male and female flowers they are present on the different plants and the flowers are unisexual in nature, then such type of plants are dioecious plants. For example, in case of papaya and date palm. In dioecious plants, it prevents both autogamy and geitonogamy. Both autogamy and geitonogamy are being prevented in dioecious plants. These diagrams shows the dioecious conditions that one of the plant it bears the unisexual female flowers and another plant this shows the unisexual male flowers. Now, in this case, if this is the male flower and the pollen grains are formed here, then these pollen grains have reached to the stigma of the flower of different plant, then this is xenogamy or allogamy or a cross pollination. Neither the autogamy nor geitonogamy are present in such type of conditions. That's why we written here that in case of dioecious plants, it prevents both autogamy and geitonogamy. Only and only cross pollination or xenogamy will occur in case of dioecious plants. Now, what are the adaptations that favors the self-pollination? Now, here we will discuss that what kind of adaptations are there that favors the self-pollination. So, first of all, first adaptation is monocliny, that means bisexuality. Bisexuality or monocliny means that the flowers are bisexual in nature, means the flowers which may contain both male and female reproductive parts, means both stamens as well as carpels, then such type of flowers are bisexual or monocliny in nature. And in such condition, they will definitely favors the self-pollination. For example, in case of pea. Another adaptation for self-pollination is homogamy. What do you mean by homogamy? Homogamy means when both the sex organs of the flower, that is the stamens and carpels, they mature at the same time. Means there will be the synchronization in pollen release as well as stigma receptivity, and that will occur only when the flower mature at the same time, then that condition is said to be homogamy. And if both the sex organs, that is the stamens and carpels, mature at the same time, then this will definitely favors the self-pollination or autogamy. This homogamy is also present in pea. Means in case of pea, self-pollination, the adaptations for self-pollination is monocliny as well as homogamy. This is the diagram which shows the plant of pea. This pea plant is bisexual in nature, having stamens, these are the anthers, and this is the stigma. Means both the sex organs are present in the same flower, means it is bisexual in nature, means monocliny is present. And stamens and stigma, they lie very close to each other, means it favors the self pollination in such kind of plant. So in pea plant, monocliny favors the self pollination. Now homogamy means in pea plant, anthers releases the pollen grains, means pollen releases and the stigma becomes receptive to accept those pollen grains. At the same time, means homogamy is also present in the pea plant, means monocliny and homogamy is found in pea plant, and that's why these two type of adaptation favors the self pollination in pea. Now another adaptation for self pollination is cleistogamy. In case of bisexual flowers which never opens throughout its lifespan, then such type of flowers are known as cleistogamy or cleistogamous flowers. Condition is said to be cleistogamy. For example, there are certain cleistogamous flowers, for example, Commelina, Viola and Oxalis. Very important topic regarding the board exams as well as for pre-medical, that what are cleistogamous flowers? Cleistogamous flowers are those which never open throughout their lifespan. So such type of flowers which never open throughout the lifespan, there will be the chances of 100% self pollination in such cases. So all of the above plants, that is Commelina, Viola and Oxalis, all these plants, they bear the two types of flowers. One type of flowers are cleistogamous flowers and another type of flowers are chasmogamous flowers. As you all know that cleistogamous flowers are those which never open throughout the lifespan, and chasmogamous flowers are those which can open. So all these three plants, they bear both type of flowers, that is cleistogamous as well as chasmogamous. Means chasmogamous flowers which are similar to the flowers of the other species with exposed anthers and stigma. So cleistogamous flowers, as they do not open throughout its lifespan, they produces the assured seed set even in the absence of pollinator. They do not open, so there will be no requirement of pollinating agents or pollinators. So in case of the cleistogamous flowers, anthers and stigma, they lie very close to each other because they are packed into a bud like condition, so they are very close to each other. So in such cases, the anthers and stigma are close to each other. When anthers dehisce in such flowers, then the pollen grains definitely come in contact with the stigma, and this leads to the self pollination. So cleistogamous flowers, they are invariably autogamous. 100% self pollination will occur in case of cleistogamous flowers. There will be no chance of cross pollination in case of cleistogamous flowers. This is the diagram of Commelina plant exhibiting normal chasmogamous flowers which are above the ground level, which are the normal flowers that can easily bloom, and these are the underground flowers. This is the ground level. So these are the underground flowers. These are the underground cleistogamous flowers which never open throughout the lifespan, and so there will be the chances of 100% chances of self pollination in such types of flowers. So cleistogamy can also be considered as one of the adaptation for self pollination. But remember that if there will be the continued self pollination, then this will lead to reduced biological fitness, or you can say inbreeding depression in a given population. But if we are talking about the Commelina or Oxalis or Viola, in which the cleistogamous flowers are present, which are invariably autogamous, but there are also the chasmogamous flowers, so cross pollination will also occur. So complete inbreeding depression will not occur in such cases. So after the adaptations for cell pollination, there are some another adaptations for cross pollination, or you can say these are some outbreeding devices for cross pollination. One is dicliny. As the monocliny means the bisexuality, dicliny means unisexuality. Unisexuality, as you all know, that flower either contain the stamen or carpel, that is either containing the male reproductive part or the female reproductive part. So this dicliny or unisexuality, it is a device that prevents the cell pollination. It prevents the cell pollination. Presence of unisexual flowers confirms the cross pollination. Presence of unisexual flowers, it confirms the cross pollination. Cell pollination never takes place in such types of unisexual flowers. For example, in case of date palm or in case of papaya, unisexuality or unisexual flowers are present, which always favors the cross pollination. It never favors the cell pollination. This is the female flower and this is the male flower. If the pollen grains are formed on in the anther and when they are released outside, then in this flower there is no female reproductive part, so there will be no chance of cell pollination. So these pollen grains, they always reach to the stigma of the different unisexual female flower. Means only there will be the chance of cross pollination. Cell pollination never take place in such type of unisexual flowers. That's why we say that dicliny or unisexuality is one of the important adaptation for cross pollination. Another type of adaptation that favors the cross pollination is dichogamy. Now in many bisexual flowers of the plants, stamens and carpels of the flower, they do not mature at the same time. If they mature at the same time, that is homogamy, it will favor the cell pollination. But if the stamens and the carpels, they do not mature at the same time, means the pollen release and the stigma receptivity, they are not in a synchronized manner, then this will favor the cross pollination and inhibiting the cell pollination. So in many bisexual flowers of the plants, if the stamens and the carpels of the flower do not mature at the same time, remember, stamens and carpel of a flower do not mature at the same time, that is known as dichogamy. Means in such plants, pollen release and stigma receptivity, they are not synchronized. So either the pollen is released before, then the stigma receptivity, or the stigma becomes receptive much before than the release of pollen. This will happen, then this is known as the dichogamy. Because of this, the dichogamy is of two types. One is protandry and another one is protogyny. Protandry means when the anthers of the flower, they will mature earlier than the carpels, then that is known as protandry. This is the protandry. When the anthers, they mature earlier than the carpels, then that is known as protandry. And majority, or you can say many of the angiosperms, they are cross pollinated by the protandrous condition. Very important, that majority of the angiosperms, they are cross pollinated only because of the protandrous condition, that is pollen released much earlier than the stigma receptivity, that favors the cross pollination. Another adaptation or another type of dichogamy is protogyny. In case of protogyny, the carpels mature earlier than the stamens. When the carpels mature earlier than the stamens, then that is known as protogyny. This also favors the cross pollination. These are the diagrams that shows the protandrous condition and protogynous condition. The first diagram, this shows the protandry. This shows the protandry. That means pollens are released from the anther, but the stigmas, they are not receptive. Means that condition is said to be protandrous condition, and this will favors these pollen grains now migrate to the stigma of the flower of the other plant. That means this favors the cross pollination. This diagram shows protogyny. This represents the protogyny. In case of protogyny, stigma becomes receptive. Stigma is ready to accept the pollens, but the pollen do not release from the anthers. They are not shedding from the anthers. Means the pollens from any other flower which are released, they reached to these stigmas. So this condition also favors the cross pollination. But out of these two type of dichogamy, protandry is found in most of the angiospermic plants. Means in most of the angiospermic plants, cross pollination occurs due to protandrous condition. Now chasmogamy or anthesis. Chasmogamy or anthesis means opening, or you can say blooming of the floral bud in form of a flower, which is also known as anthesis. And if the flower opens, then stamens and carpels get exposed, and there will be the chances of cross pollination in such cases. So chasmogamy or anthesis, in which the anthers and stigmas are exposed, so they favors the cross pollination. This is the blooming flower which shows the exposed stamens, and the exposed stigma, that definitely helps in cross pollination. Now another adaptation for cross pollination is heterostyly. Heterostyly means if there will be the difference in the length of filaments of the stamens and the length of the style in flowers of some plant, then that is known as heterostyly. What is heterostyly? Means if there will be the difference in the length of the filament of stamens and the length of the style, then there will be then that condition is known as heterostyly. Some of the plants having long stamens and short style, and in some other plants they bear the long style and short stamen. In both these conditions, because anther and stigma, they are not at the same level, they are at the different positions, the pollen cannot come in contact with the stigma of the same flower, and this will inhibit the self pollination and favors the cross pollination. So due to this reason, self pollination is not possible in these plants. The two conditions may appear in the plants, that is, one condition is either the stamens are long and the styles are short, and the another condition may be there are certain plants in which the styles are long and stamens are short. In both the conditions, anther and stigma, they are at the different positions, and so the pollens, they are not come in contact with the stigma of the same flower, and this will inhibit the self pollination and favors the cross pollination. Like this, the first diagram shows that the style is long and the stamens are shorter, means long styled condition, and another diagram shows short style, means the style is short and the stamens are longer. So this shows the heterostyly adaptation which favors the cross pollination. Another adaptation for cross pollination that will inhibit the self pollination, that is self sterility, or you can say self incompatibility, or you can say intra-specific incompatibility. A question will be given in NCERT also about self sterility, and a detailed question will be asked in the exams also. So be prepared for this also. The self sterility or self incompatibility, it is a genetic mechanism. It is a genetic mechanism, and it prevents the self pollen. It prevents the self pollen, that is the pollen from the same flower or the other flower of the same plant, that is the self pollen. So it is a genetic mechanism that prevents the self pollen from fertilizing the ovules, prevents the self pollen from fertilizing the ovules by inhibiting the pollen germination, or you can say the formation of the pollen tube in the pistil. That is known as self incompatibility. That is, through diagram we can explain this. Suppose we can say any flower which are having certain genes, that is the S1 S2 genes. Pollens are also of the same genes, containing the same genes. Suppose if the stigma accepts the pollens of S3 and S4 genes, and its self genes are S1 and S2, so it accepts S3 and S4 pollen, S3 and S4 pollens having the genes, so they will form the pollen tube which will migrate inside the style part. But if the pollens that contains the genes S3 and S1, they will come on the stigma, and in that condition the pollen containing the S3 gene, it will form the pollen tube. It will form the pollen tube. But the pollen grain that contains the S1 gene, it will be inhibited by the stigma. Means it inhibits the pollen germination. That pollen will not germinate. Means in this case the self pollen, this S1, it will considered as the self pollen. So that self pollen will be inhibited. That self pollen is not forming the pollen tube in this case. Similar in the third case, if the pollen grains containing S2 and S1 genes, they are present on, or they are reaches the stigma, then both these pollen grains are also considered as the self pollen. Both these pollens are considered the self pollen, and so if the stigma do not accept these self pollen, then these two pollens, they do not form the pollen tube in this case also. So these three cases, this shows the self sterility or self incompatibility, in which the stigma do not accept its own pollen or it's the self pollen. Means that's why we can say that self incompatibility, it is a genetic mechanism, gene controlled mechanism, in which the self pollen that is coming either from the same flower or from the other flower of the same plant, from fertilizing the ovule or inhibiting the pollen germination or the pollen tube formation. And in such situations, these pollens, they will go or they will migrate to the stigma of the other plant. Means it inhibits the self pollination but favors the cross pollination. So after pollination, now the agents of pollination. There are certain pollinating agents that help in pollination. So the plants, they use two abiotic pollinating agents and one biotic pollinating agent. The two abiotic pollinating agents, they may be wind and water, and biotic pollinating agents are animals. So these are the biotic and abiotic pollinating agents. Majority of the plants, they use the biotic agents for pollination. If we are talking about the agents of pollination, then these are the two abiotic pollinating agents. One is, that is the pollination by wind, that is known as anemophily, and if the pollination, it takes place by means of water, then that is known as hydrophily. There is only one biotic agent, that is the animals. So the pollination when occurs by means of animals, then that is known as zoophily. Now those animals may be of different types. It may be insects, then such type of pollination is known as entomophily. Remember, whenever the suffix phily comes, that means it refers to the pollination. If suppose anemophily terms comes, that means the anemo means the wind, hydro means the water. So anemophily means the pollination when occurs by wind, hydrophily means the pollination occurs by water. Now here if the pollination occurs by animal, then that is known as zoophily. If the pollination occurs by insects, then that is known as entomophily. If the pollination occurs by birds, then that is known as ornithophily. If the pollination occurs by means of bats, then that is known as chiropterophily. That is known as chiropterophily. If they occurs by means of ants or termites, then that is known as myrmecophily. That type of pollination which occurs by ants or termites, that is considered as myrmecophily. If the pollination occurs through snails, then that is known as malcophily or malmacophily. And if it occurs by means of snakes, then that is known as ophiophily. That is known as ophiophily. So now we are discussing here about the abiotic agents. Only a small proportion of plants, they use the abiotic agents. If the pollen grains, they are coming in contact with the stigma, it is a chance factor when the pollination occurs by means of wind or through water. There is a very least chances that the pollens reaches to the stigma. There is a chance factor. So to compensate that chance factor or uncertainties or the associated loss of the pollen grains, such type of flowers, they produces the enormous amount of the pollen grains. They produce the enormous amount of the pollen grains when compared to the number of ovules available for pollination. Remember this point, very important point regarding the abiotic agents, that since there will be the chance factor, so to compensate that uncertainties and the loss of pollen grains, in that case the flowers, they will produce the enormous amount of pollen grains as compared to that of the pollens which are available for the pollination. So both wind and water pollinated flowers, they are not very colorful and they do not produce the nectar. They do not require the color nor the nectar. Remember this point, that in case of abiotic agent, that is wind and water, such type of pollinated flowers, they are not very colorful and they do not produce nectar. They do not require nectar. Now first case is anemophily, that is if the pollination is carried out by means of wind, that is known as anemophily. When the pollen grains, they are transferred from one flower to another flower through the wind, then that is known as anemophily. And such type of flowers are termed as anemophilous flowers. Those flowers in which the anemophily is present, or those flowers which exhibits the anemophily, those flowers are termed as anemophilous flowers. So what are the question here arises, that what are the major characters of the anemophilous flowers? So the characters of the anemophilous flowers are that they produce the enormous amount of the pollen grains. They should produce enormous amount of pollen grains because it is a chance factor that they reaches the stigma. They should possess the well exposed stamens so that the pollens are easily dispersed into the wind currents. This is another important point, that they possess the well exposed stamens. If the stamens are well exposed into the environment, the pollens are easily dispersed into the wind currents. The third important point or third important character of anemophilous flowers are that they are neither attractive nor they have any fragrance. They do not have nectar glands. Such type of flowers, they do not require any, do not have any kind of nectar gland, and such type of flowers are unisexual in nature. So these are the important characteristics of anemophilous flowers. Now the anemophilous flowers have certain type of pollens. So the characters of those pollens are that those pollen grains, they must be very small in size, they must be light in weight, and they are dry, means they should be non-sticky in nature. These are the features or the characters of the pollen grains in case of anemophily. Now, what is the character of the stigma? So, stigma, it must be large so as to accept the pollen grains which are traveling through wind currents. So, stigma or the landing platform should be large in such cases. Those stigmas, they must be hairy or feathery so as to easily trap the airborne pollen grains. If there are certain hairs or filaments or hair, feather or brush-like structures over the stigma, they can easily trap the pollen grains which are traveling into the wind currents. And they possesses the mucilaginous substance, means that the stigma should be sticky or mucilaginous so that the pollen grain when comes over the stigma, it will stick over the surface of the stigma. So all these features, that is the features of anemophilous flowers as well as pollen grains as well as stigma, they favors the anemophily. But in case of anemophily, there will be the maximum loss of pollen grains takes place. In this type of pollination, there will be the maximum loss of pollen grains. That's why enormous amount of pollen grains are formed in this case. And since why there will be the maximum loss of pollen grains? Because it is non-directional. Wind can take the pollen grains in any of the direction, not in a particular direction. That means it is a non-directional process. Non-directional process, that's why there will be the maximum loss of pollen grains. Wind pollinated flowers, they usually have the single ovule. As we have already discussed that in case of anemophilous flowers, enormous amount of pollen grains are formed as compared to the ovules which are available for the pollination. So in case of wind pollinated flowers, they usually contain the single ovule in each ovary, and numerous flowers, they are packed into the inflorescences. They are packed into inflorescence. For example, in case of corn cob, that is the maize. The tassels, they are actually the styles and the stigmas which wave into the wind so as to trap the pollen grains. They wave into the wind so easily trap the pollen grains. Pollination by the wind is more common among the abiotic pollinations. We have seen that they are the two pollinating agents in case of the abiotic components, wind and water. So most of the pollination in plants, they may occur by wind. So pollination by wind is more common amongst the abiotic pollinations. Wind pollination is quite common in grasses. These are the diagrams which shows the wind pollination in case of maize plant. Wind pollination is the maize plant. This is the male inflorescence and this is the female inflorescence, and these are the tassels, that is actually the styles and the stigmas which wave into the wind so as to easily trap the pollen grains moving into the wind. This diagram shows a wind pollinated plant showing the compact inflorescence and the well exposed stamens. So today we discussed about the pollination, types of pollination, what are the agents of pollination, in which we discussed here about one abiotic agent of pollination, that is the wind, and the pollination that have been because of wind, that is known as anemophily. In the next lecture, we will discuss the remaining agents of the pollination, that is the water, that is hydrophily, and also the animals, that is zoophily. Thank you.